This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. We begin this Thursday's programming with rangeland specialist Carol Baldwin to discuss her research on woody encroachment in Kansas. She shares that being proactive about managing healthy grasslands and working outwards is the best approach when trying to tackle what can be a costly management issue. Also ahead, K-State beef reproductive specialist Sandy Johnson joins us to provide advice on heifer selection. Sandy highlights that while genetics do play a key role in breeding decisions, selecting a good heifer often has to deal more with reproductive efficiencies and timelines. We end today's show with Cassie Thiessen, Extension Horticulture Agent for the Post Rock District, discussing watering houseplants. She recently spoke about this topic during this month's Garden Hour programming. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are joined now by K-State Rangeland Specialist with our Extension Unit of Agriculture, Natural Resources, and Community Vitality here at K-State, Carol Baldwin. And she's joining us today for a conversation on woody encroachment in Kansas, specifically in our prairie land. So, Carol, thanks so much for joining us today.
So glad to be here.
Absolutely. So this conversation, it was specifically sparked because not too long ago, you received a grant hoping to kind of negate this issue specifically in Kansas, right?
Yes, it's a really large issue in Kansas, and it's growing worse. The health of old-growth native rangelands in Kansas and the Great Plains is in peril from woody encroachment.
When we say woody encroachment, what does that really look like?
Well, woody encroachment looks like additional trees and brush into what should be core grasslands, should be intact grasslands without trees and brush. And that encompasses most of the rangelands in Kansas.
And when we think about the expansion of this, what kind of impacts does that have on our Kansas ecosystems?
The ecosystems can be impacted in several ways. Rangeland ecosystems impacted by woody encroachment includes the loss of ranching livelihoods as available grazing decreases, a loss of grassland wildlife habitat, and increased risk of grassland species being listed as endangered species. Surface and groundwater replenishment is decreased, which also reduces grass growth. And as grass is replaced by volatile species like eastern red cedar, wildfires become more intense and difficult to control.
In times like these, when we're dealing with drought, that becomes more and more of a concern, I'm sure, for many of our producers. And, you mentioned that a loss of forage is a big part of this, and there's some impactful numbers in terms of the actual amount of that happens here in Kansas, right?
Yes, about 1.5 million pounds of forage has been lost in Kansas between 1990 and 2019, solely due to woody encroachment. And this would have supported about another 326,000 cows.
Wow. Well, that's an incredible number to think about, especially like we said, in terms of a drought year like this year when that extra grass would have been much appreciated for our producers out here in Kansas. So, Carol, as we continue thinking on about woody encroachment and kind of the species of these plants that affect Kansas specifically, what are kind of the main concerns or the main species of concerns when we think about these?
It depends a little bit on where you are in Kansas, which species are of the most concern. By far across the state, eastern red cedar is the main concern. It's an early invasive species. It creates conditions for other trees to grow, and it's highly adapted. It's native, but it was always confined by fire to small patches and not widespread distribution that we see today. Also, bison impacted red cedar in a way that cattle did not. They were very hard on cedar. They pushed it over. Basically, bison and red cedar do not coexist.
Yeah, and we've seen those numbers decrease, obviously, a lot across our state, so it makes sense that these trees are now flourishing in areas where they used to not. When it comes to encroachment as we see it now, one of the reasons we're seeing it expand rapidly like we are, maybe the decrease in bison numbers and maybe less burning happening than we would hope. Why are we seeing this expansion so much more today than maybe, even a decade ago?
Expansion is sort of a geometric multiplication. The initial expansion sort of grows because the areas next to where woody encroachment also occurs become more liable to woody encroachment. So seed spread especially is high, and it can move. They've estimated about 2 football fields away from the source tree. So that puts many rangelands at risk for encroachment. As the problem spreads, more and more land becomes closer to trees.
When we were talking beforehand about this topic, areas in western Kansas, they are now seeing rapid expansion, right? And there's some specific reasons for that.
Yes, for many years, decades even, woody encroachment has not seemed to be a problem in western Kansas. And even today, many people say it won't happen out here. But in reality, it is happening. It's just more slow because of the lower rainfall and because there were fewer woody encroached acres to start with. But waiting is not a good option to control the problem.
The control is where you come in with this grant specifically, right? That's kind of your goal with this grant that you've received, is putting together strategies to help, stop the spread. So what are some of those strategies that you are thinking about specifically when it comes to this research?
So the new research out of the University of Nebraska emphasizes the need to protect the core grasslands. So the grasslands that are intact still today, that are functioning at the ecosystem level, that's great. That's the best rangeland we have. And instead of waiting until it's covered with brush to go treat it, which in the past has been one management strategy, it's been shown that protecting the core and then building out, adding the near adjacent areas to that and controlling brush, even though it's under an early stage of encroachment, is a much more effective way to reclaim the grasslands, because you're continually working away at the outside edge where the grasslands meet the encroached acres. So the basic strategy of what NRCS and K-State is looking at is to anchor their treatments in the no or low woody expansion area, the intact grasslands, stabilize those grasslands, address dispersal and recruitment to stop expansion, and this is where prescribed fire comes in, and then finally to treat the areas that have converted to woodland. Areas that have already converted to woodlands are expensive to treat, and the treatments don't last nearly as long as those in early stages of encroachment.
Wonderful. Well, good to know. You mentioned stabilizing intact grasslands. So what does that process sort of look like when it comes to stabilization of things that are, in good condition, but we're trying to be proactive instead of reactive?
So stabilization means practicing good range management, and that includes frequent prescribed fire, especially in the eastern Kansas where the rainfall amounts are higher. It also would include things like proper grazing management, reducing fragmentation into small units that are more easily exposed to trees from housing plantings and other things like that, and just basically taking care of the land.
We've kind of outlined here that this is a proactive approach, and that's important here when we think about reducing control costs. You mentioned that. So the lifetime investment that it takes to be proactive about this, what does that look like compared to the afterthought of, now we have a problem, what are we going to do now?
So the economic analyses of this are just now being done, but it is becoming increasingly obvious that it is much, much less expensive to address this earlier than later. There's two parts to that. One is the actual control methods. As plants get larger, they become more difficult to control with prescribed burning, which is the most economical method of controlling woody plants. And secondly, as the grasslands transition towards woodlands, there will be more and more years when seed from woody species remains in the soil.
Absolutely. So an accumulation almost effect there when these trees have been mature for longer and they're building up these seed populations. That just takes longer to take care of.
It does, and it takes much more intense management once you've reached that stage.
Absolutely. And I guess when it comes to kind of the timeline of all of this, that's even something that you're saving if you take a proactive approach. Is we talked about prescribed burns, planning for those take time, having the resources available takes time to put together. So even being proactive about it now might save you years down the road much needed time to do other things.
Yes, it's the most economical way is to keep your prescribed burning up to date and use mechanical and chemical control where necessary.
Absolutely. So your project specifically, tell us a bit more about it, the research that's being done, what you've currently accomplished, and where you hope to see it go here in the next several years.
Well, our project is outreach-based, and we're trying to find out what the main issues are with woody plant control. Why are our farmers and ranchers unable or unwilling to do practices that will reduce woody encroachment and try and get this moving in the opposite direction? Other things we're looking at is to find out what information would be most useful for farmers and ranchers and the form that they would prefer it in. And we're focused on 3 core grassland areas in Kansas, the Flint Hills, the Smoky Hills, and the Red Hills, which have the most intact grasslands in the state. Our overall objectives include cost analysis of the various practices at different levels of invasion. This project will also include reaching out to absentee landowners. Overall, we're looking for improved rangeland management and better programs with NRCS that are more effective and applicable to woody control.
Some great focus areas there, like you mentioned. And I know that NRCS and K-State have this sort of grassland initiative that is going on. What does that really include for producers that are interested in learning more about that program?
So the Kansas NRCS Grassland Initiative is part of the Great Plains Roadmap, which is an overall framework for all the agencies to work together to address this problem. And specifically in Kansas, in these core grassland areas that I mentioned before, includes numerous practices for cost sharing in an effort to really tackle this woody encroachment problem. These practices include prescribed fire, pest management, brush management, mechanical removal, goats, haying, prescribed grazing, and woody residue treatment, as well as fire break installation. And if you're interested in any of these programs and finding cost share, please see your local NRC office for more details about this program.
Absolutely. A way for producers getting started in this way to help prevent woody encroachment in their own areas. So that's a great resource for sure. And I'll be sure to link to that resource as well in the show notes of today's show, which can be found on agtoday.net. But Carol, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a great conversation, especially this time of year.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Once again, everyone, that was K-State Rangeland Specialist Carol Baldwin joining us for a conversation on woody encroachment. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are joined now by K-State Beef Reproductive Specialist Sandy Johnson for a conversation on heifer selection. So before we get started, first and foremost, Sandy, thanks so much for joining us today.
Well, glad to be here.
Absolutely. Glad to have you. So like I said, heifer selection is what we're going to focus on. So first and foremost, Sandy, when we're thinking about a heifer, what makes a good heifer? What should come to mind first and foremost?
Right. So for me, I want a heifer that conceives early, calves early, raises a calf every year, and does it for a long time. You know, those are the things that we want her to do. And then we need to help her by the choices we make in terms of what types of bulls we use to generate the calves she's producing. But I think we often overlook when we're thinking about heifers and heifer selection. We love our heifers and we want to evaluate them, but we need to step back and remember that a majority of producers are still raising their own replacements. And so the bull they select to sire those heifers is really the first step in heifer selection.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I feel like we think of our perfect heifer and there's a lot of guessing that goes into this process, right? Because there's not always that, for sure we can predict when exactly she'll conceive, when exactly she'll have that calf, that sort of thing. But like you said, our selection tools in terms of what we select to sire her with, that's really where we set her up for success, right?
Right. That's where we need to start. And so when we think about bull selection, and most of us don't even want to start this far back, but as we think about bull selection, and this kind of the preface to all this discussion is that we need to think about how we're generating replacements. And I said majority of producers raise their own, but yet that's still an important part of this discussion, how you generate replacements, how you're marketing your calves, and then environmental and labor constraints. Now, we can't get into all of that, but obviously that's important components of this. But then when we think about the bull, probably the breed aspect may just blow right by us, but I want to remind producers of the very importance of the impact of heterosis on reproduction. In just a F1 Hereford Angus cow, we're going to increase the number of calves born and the cumulative weaning weight by having that F1 cow, 25% increase in cumulative weaning weight and about 17% increase in the number of calves born. So when we think about a little bit of this, a little bit of that, this is big dollars, okay, in terms of more calves that pay off. And so breed and breed selection is very important, and we just can't underestimate enough the power of the heterosis. And it's more if we cross Bos indicus, Bos taurus. So that's my soapbox on the crossbred cow. But then when we go to within whatever breed and what we have, we want to think about traits that are going to impact the fertility and longevity of that female. And so maternal calving ease is that trait that measures her ability to lay down and have a calf, the ease that calf is born. And so we need to think about that. Many people may look at scrotal circumference, indication of age of puberty in daughters. But, at this point, I would argue we got a lot of traits to select for. Unless your particular situation is having trouble with age of puberty, there should be some minimum, but let's not get too hung up there. We're getting more information about heifer pregnancy, and if we could get more of our breed associations to use whole herd data, we could improve that information. That would be very valuable in bull selection, and as well as some type of stayability or how long that cow is in the herd. So when we think about the bull that's siring the females we want to keep, those are some of the traits that we want to look for. And of course, that bull is going to influence multiple females in your herd.
Like you mentioned before, these are generations that we're talking about here. And sometimes I feel like, that can make our producers' head spin. They're like, oh, goodness, this is a lot of planning that goes into that. And kudos to our producers that have to deal with this every single year, because really it's a lot of forward thinking that you're doing in these cases.
Right. And there's some other data we could talk about that kind of looks at that planning horizon. It's kind of interesting on, am I looking the next 5 years or am I looking 20 years out? How that changes some of your trait selection and some things, but that's probably digressing from our main point today. But it is important to think about that whole goals and where you're trying to get and how soon you want to get there.
Absolutely. And focusing back into our conversation with heifer selection, if we're thinking of heifers that we have now today, the culling process and the timeline of that, it's kind of important. So what are your tips for producers when it comes to that aspect of this?
Well, depending on what your situation is and essentially how many replacements you need and how you're generating those, for a commercial producer, essentially using heifers that conceive early is worth about one more calf to them in the lifetime of that replacement heifer, which, $1,000 better now, the value of that heifer that conceives early versus one that conceives later. And we're probably going to be hard pressed to point to some other trait that's going to generate us more money other than the fact that maybe she's a crossbred cow versus a straight bred cow. So we can deal with that information a couple ways. If we have more heifers than we need for our own replacements, we can turn them all out with the bull or AI them once, whatever breeding method we're going to use, and keep those that conceive in the first 30 days or whatever. And right now you're going to say, well, heifers are going to be worth a lot of money. I'm going to breed up as many as I can and sell what I don't need. And I've got no problem with that. But what I would say is make sure to identify those early pregnants and keep those for yourself. All right. Those are the ones that are going to be most valuable for you. And, again, I'm thinking primarily as a commercial producer. If you're a purebred breeder, you may be thinking about other things, but being born early, and I'm not the oldest child in my family, and it makes it hard for me to say that being older is more important in this case. And it truly is. Age is important and worth a lot. So, I think people need to think about that. When we're selecting heifers, those that are born early themselves are more likely to conceive early, just again by virtue of age. So don't overlook that value. And we didn't talk about size when we were talking about bull selection, but certainly we can influence mature size if we need to be changing mature size in our bull selection. And while our temptation is we love our biggest heifers and they seem to be best, maybe we need to let those very biggest heifers go. They'll market well, think about how that fits into your longer goals.
A lot of things to keep in mind when it comes to heifer selection, and having that long-term outlook really is key in this situation. So when it comes to this upcoming season, when it comes to breeding heifers and selecting, what are some final notes and final takeaways that you'd like for producers to walk away with today from listening to our conversation?
Yeah, so age is important, but then, we've got to have a structurally sound animal. Temperament has got to fit your herd. I mean, if you can't be in the same neighborhood, let her go. Maybe you're culling off those very biggest heifers we've been selecting for growth. And you may want to, you can argue with this both ways, selecting females out of older cows. Their mother has been in the herd a long time, okay? And you may argue now that if we got a little heifer pregnancy data, that's as good as knowing she's out of an older cow. I think you can argue that two ways at this point in time. But think about those trade-offs of my younger cows are going to be my best genetics, theoretically, if I'm doing a good job at selection versus, the 10-year-old cow. Yes, she's proven herself, but maybe she's older, quote unquote, genetics in my herd. Those are some of the trade-offs. And, then I don't think I can ignore convenience traits like, if this cow had a blown out udder, well, she'd have to have a lot of other good things about her that I'm not, looking down on her. But those would be the types of things that are important to me. And again, primarily thinking from a commercial producer's outlook. And if you are taking cattle to harvest, you may have some other things you're thinking about and trying to make selection. But again, how you selecting the sires of those heifers, I think, is where you make the most progress in some of those other traits. So we want to use our bull selection to drive traits like ribeye area or marbling, and not necessarily get as concerned about an individual heifer's response in that trait. The value of when she's bred is still going to be more important than whether she's a plus X or a plus Y for a particular trait. It's just hard to outdo the age. Use bull selection to change your overall genetics.
Absolutely. Yeah. Understanding the interactions of those maternal and paternal characteristics and really utilizing them to your advantage. Key here in this tricky subject of reproduction and breeding. But as always, Sandy, we appreciate your insight on the subject and all of the advice that you have to offer. So thanks so much for joining us.
Yes, thank you. Glad to be here.
Absolutely glad to have you, everyone. Once again, that was K-State Beef Reproductive Specialist Sandy Johnson joining us for a conversation on heifer selection. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Samantha Bennett, I'm Jeff Wickman. Over 2/3 of U.S. households have at least one houseplant, and caring for them can often be confusing. The March K-State Garden Hour webinar series focuses on how to care for houseplants. Cassie Thiessen, Extension Horticulture Agent for the Post Rock District, says that watering is one of the most important pieces of houseplant success because it's the number one killer of houseplants.
It's definitely easy to overwater or to underwater because there's really no general rule. There's lots of factors that go into how much water your plant needs. So the first thing to consider is your plant's native environment. So if you think about like a succulent plant or a cacti, they're from desert areas. So they have thick leaves that retain moisture. So often they don't need as much water as a plant like a croton. It's a tropical plant. It likes humidity. It likes lots of water. So when you go get a new plant, I suggest to kind of do your research and know where that plant comes from and kind of what it likes for water and for light needs. A few other things to consider. Think about the season. So usually this time of year in winter, our plants aren't actively growing, and so they don't need quite as much water. Again, I say it depends because I work in the basement of a courthouse, and we have a boiler system, and it gets really hot in my office. So a lot of times my plants do dry out in the winter and do need some extra water. So think about that environment. Think about where you're placing your pot. Is it near an air vent? Is it near a window where that draft might cause the soil to dry out? Think about the material of the pot. So terracotta pots, those clay pots, are very porous. And so water is going to evaporate out of them a little bit quicker. So that might be a good thing. If you are someone that tends to overwater your plants, you might consider using a terracotta pot because it is more porous. And also think about the size of the pot. If you have a little tiny pot that you just put a new little cutting in, it's probably going to dry out quicker than a big pot that can hold more moisture. Also think about if your plant is blooming. If you have an African violet that is pushing out buds and blooms, it's probably going to need more water than one that is just a foliage plant.
Thiessen says another tricky part is knowing when to water because you can't water on a schedule.
I wish I could tell you to water your houseplants, every Wednesday at noon for 1 minute and they'd be perfect, but that's not how it works. So we need to look for some signs that our plant might need water. So if you've ever heard of the finger test, you can kind of stick your finger in the first inch or two of the soil and see how it feels. If it feels dry or if you can feel some moisture in the soil. I also like to lift the pot to kind of feel the weight. If it's heavier, there might be some water still in the soil. Consider your pot type. If it's a plastic pot that's pretty light or a ceramic pot, that might be more heavy. But I always kind of lift mine up just to see how it feels. And then probably the easiest way to tell that your plants need water is if they start to wilt. So I don't know how many people on the Zoom have had a peace lily plant, but they are very dramatic and they will just wilt like crazy when they need water. But then once you water them, they pop right back up. So a lot of times, the plant will tell you what it needs. If you are someone that really struggles with watering, you can use a moisture meter. And that's just a probe you stick down in the soil and it will tell you how much water you have in your pot. And then my tip is just if you struggle and you aren't sure if your plant needs water, when in doubt, wait it out. A lot of times overwatering is worse than underwatering. So maybe wait a day, come back and see what it looks like after that.
As for how to water houseplants, Thiessen recommends using room temperature water.
So I always fill up my watering jugs and let them set for a little bit just to get to room temperature. And that also helps to dissolve any salts or minerals in the water. And then water to fully saturate the soil. So you want to, if you're watering from the top of your plant, you want water to come out those drain holes and into a saucer. And then kind of let that sit in the saucer for a little bit and then go ahead and discard that excess water. And that's just because you don't want your plant sitting in a saucer of water because that can really create some root rot issues.
That's Cassie Thiessen, the Extension Horticulture Agent for the Post Rock District. Cassie and Calla Edwards, the Extension Horticulture Agent for Butler County, also covered fertilizing houseplants in the webinar, along with light, repotting, propagating, pest control, and other concerns for houseplants. The complete webinar is available online by searching for K-State Garden Hour. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Samantha Bennett, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.